Hi, and welcome back to Heimlich History. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the Vietnam War, which is about as depressing as a Tyrannosaurus Rex who has decided that his life purpose is to be a professional basketball player. Think about it for a second. He can't even pick up the ball. I don't even know if I can do this anymore.
It's time to kick it old school.
In a little country across the Pacific Ocean called Vietnam, the natives have been trying to throw off French colonial rule since World War I. Now initially, the United States was very much into helping, but over time, the Vietnamese, under the leadership of a guy named Ho Chi Minh, committed the unpardonable crime of becoming more and more communist. And as you know, by the time the Cold War rolled around, America was positively allergic to communists. So Ho Chi Minh won a decisive victory in the struggle for independence, and at a council in Geneva, Vietnam was split at the 17th parallel, in which a communist government led by Ho Chi Minh was established in the north, and a more Western-friendly democratic government was established in the south. And they agreed that within 2 years they would have elections to reunify Vietnam. But 2 years later, the American-backed Southern Vietnamese government could see that it was going to lose that vote, so they didn't hold it. America had apparently backed the wrong horse, but we were doubling down anyway. And as it turned out, the South Vietnamese government was getting more corrupt and unstable by the day. So President Kennedy ordered a massive spike of what he called military advisors to go to South Vietnam and see what was happening and try to stabilize the area politically. Turns out they didn't like what they saw over there and went ahead and facilitated an overthrow of the government and created the very instability that they were there trying to avoid. But Kennedy kept insisting this was their war, not ours. But at this point, America had made ever-deepening political commitments that were getting more and more difficult to back out of. Well, Kennedy went ahead and got himself assassinated. Well, that came out of nowhere. So now Lyndon B. Johnson is president, and he inherits this whole Vietnam mess. So in 1965, the North Vietnamese bombed an American airfield in South Vietnam, and Johnson ordered an immediate airstrike in retaliation. And since he was sending planes in, he thought he might as well go ahead and send American troops in as well. By the end of 1965, somewhere in the neighborhood of 184,000 American troops were slodging through the Vietnamese jungles and rice paddies looking for Vietnamese guerrillas. Well, this plan wasn't working, so Johnson decided to escalate American involvement step by step. And he reasoned that this kind of escalation would result in minimal loss of life on the American side and on the Vietnamese side. But as it turned out, the North Vietnamese matched the escalation for every step up the Americans took. Meanwhile, the South Vietnamese popped some popcorn and watched the Americans take over their war. So by 1968, more than 500,000 troops had been committed to Vietnam, and the yearly bill for this war was $30 million, and there was no end in sight. I mean, nothing was in favor of continuing this war. The rest of the world looked at this conflict and was utterly perplexed. I mean, why was America, the foremost superpower of the world, bullying this little nation on the other side of the world? And at home, the opinion of the war was seriously deteriorating also. Anti-war demonstrations grew more and more frequent, and as the draft drew more and more men into the conflict, thousands of Americans fled to Canada or publicly burned their draft cards. By early 1968, the war in Vietnam had become the longest and most unpopular foreign war in the history of America. There were precious few Americans who could even tell you why this fight was going on. And if there's no reason, why is the government plucking our sons from the land and dropping them into the South Asian slaughterhouse? By this time, over 100,000 Americans had been either killed or wounded, and the American planes had dropped more bombs on this tiny country than they had in all of Europe in World War II. That T-Rex is never going to pick up the ball, is he? Add to all of that, President Johnson made the most unwise move of ordering the FBI to covertly attack members of the peace movement at home. And this had the effect of making the federal government look like something out of a George Orwell novel. And just as congressmen in favor of the war were telling the American public that the war was almost won, the North Vietnamese exploded in a powerful attack on the Americans known as the Tet Offensive. 27 key South Vietnamese cities were destroyed, and even though the Americans eventually pushed them back, it showed that the end of the war was nowhere in sight. So let's see if a new president can help us bring this war to an end. Meet Richard Nixon. He became president in 1969, and one of the platforms he ran on was something called Vietnamization, which means that we were going to give the Vietnam War back to the Vietnamese. And to that end, he committed to removing 540,000 American troops from Vietnam so that the Vietnamese Vietnamese could take up their own cause. But it was too little, too late. Anti-war fervor reached a fever pitch at home. Activists wanted immediate withdrawal of American troops. But Nixon further enraged all these folks when he ordered strikes on Cambodia, which was a haven of North Vietnamese resistance, and a surge of American forces went into that fighting. Students at Kent State University gathered for protest, which escalated into rioting. Twitchy National Guard members ended up shooting 4 members of the protest, and now the nation was coming apart. Well, Nixon resigned from the presidency, and that's another story altogether. And now Gerald Ford inherited this war. Fraught with increasing hostility from the North Vietnamese, Ford asked Congress for yet another escalation, a request that they flatly denied. And finally, now American troops were being removed from Vietnam, and the war was being given over to the South Vietnamese. But it didn't take long before the North Vietnamese came thundering across the 17th parallel and destroyed the South Vietnamese resistance. It was a tragic end to what was a tragic war. Now, technically speaking, America didn't actually lose this war since the war never belonged to us in the first place. But the loss was tangible nonetheless. America had lost face in the eyes of the world, lost confidence in its political leaders, lost much of its economic gain that had resulted from World War II, and most tragic of all, had lost the lives of over 56,000 of its sons. I'm sorry, T-Rex, you're just never gonna be a baller. There's just not a happy ending to this story. I'll see you next time.